Welcome everybody to our Siyum Masechet Avodah Zarah. Very, very excited to be here. We're excited to have a special evening. We're going to have this Siyum as usual. We'll learn the last daf together. We will hear from Khaya Eisenberg and from Terri Krivosha, who's finishing HaShas with us. So we have a great program. We're going to get started with our learning. So Siyum Masechet Avodah Zarah, in honor of Terri Krivosha, is dedicated with love and pride to Terri from her husband, Rabbi Chaim Herring, and her children, Tamar, Avi, and Shana, her grandchildren, Noam, Liba, and Orly, for completing her first Daf Yomi cycle. You embody the words of Micha 6, chapter 6, verse 8, and do justice, love goodness, and walk modestly with Hashem. We're very excited for you, Terri. We're so happy that you're sharing this exciting moment with us. Okay, with that, we're going to learn our last, and I would say quite interesting daf of end of Avodah Zarah. It's going to be a little tedious in the beginning, and then it's going to have a kind of surprise ending, so be prepared. We're starting with line 4. I finished a little extra in daf yesterday. Hopefully everyone got up to that. We're starting from the words Rami le Rav Amram le Rav Sheshet. So we had a Mishnah. We're talking at the end of this Masechet all about koshering, and we're getting into the nitty-gritty details of how we kosher utensils. And in the Mishnah, it had said that after it described the different ways that we kosher things, it said that the askala, based on libun, which we know is burning things, things that were used for fire on the fire have to be burned with a fire. So then it said this askala. Okay, we're going to read it right now. Rami le Rav Amram le Rav Sheshet. It says in our Mishnah, Tnan hashapudin v'haaskala milabnam be'ol. Okay, the shipudim, the spits, and the askala, which are the metal racks, you have to burn them with fire. That's how you kosher them. Vahatanya, but wait, there's a braita that seems to contradict. It says gabe kodshim. It's a braita. It's actually a Mishnah in Zvachim. It says Tanya really should be Tanan. It's a Mishnah in Zvachim, and there it actually talks about different rules about koshering, and we're going to see that it's a little bit different. Gabe kodshim. Now, the issue with kodshim is you have sacrificial items, and they also need to be kosher. Why do they need to be kosher? What's not kosher about them? Well, the issue is that there's something called notar, and it's actually, you can already always sense this, that we're getting up to something new. Okay, we're about to do harayot, and after that is zvachim. So they're already kind of preparing you for zvachim by bringing in this Mishnah from zvachim about sacrificial items. Now the issue there is that if you have meat that was left over, so chatat, for example, and things like a chatat have one day that you can leave them over, and after, like, they have to be eaten that day. Already by the next day, they're disqualified. They're called notar. And if you cook the shipud with which has in it the leftover meat, then you're going to end up with an issue because what's going to happen? Well, the next day it's going to spit out notar, and notar is forbidden, and we don't want that to happen. So you have to kosher them actually on a regular basis. So hashapuva askala. Now, what would you expect the permission to say? You'd expect it to say, since it's used on a spit and it's used on the fire, and they would burn the meat on the fire, you would need to basically use libum. That's what you would expect it to say. But it says magilam b'chamin. Magilam b'chamin means you boil it in hot water. That sounds a little bit strange. So Amrle Amram Bari, Ma'inyan Kodashim Etzel Giulei Ovdei Kochavim. Okay, so Rav Amram said to Rav Sheshet, here we have this contradiction. And Rav Sheshet's going to say, what are you talking about? You're comparing apples and oranges. Hacha heterabala, hacha activisura. These are two totally, completely different things. When the meat got absorbed into if we're talking about the spit of the non-kosher in our Mishnah, that forbidden item gets absorbed. If you're talking about the kodshim, that's a permitted item that got absorbed and became usher the next day. So you can't compare those two. I'm already going to warn you, and I'm going to tell you that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're going to have 6 different responses here. Okay, this is not a simple sugya here. We're going to start with first attempt to resolve the contradiction, and each attempt we're going to reject and reject and reject. So I'm a Rava. Rava says, that's a silly explanation. What's the difference? Self ki kapalit, isur kapalit. What's the difference? How it absorbed is a matter of how the taste comes out. And if the taste is forbidden when it comes out, when you cook it the next day, then it would have to come out in the same way. And basically, it shouldn't matter whether it was absorbed as something permitted or absorbed as something forbidden. Either way, it should be the same. So Rava, okay, this often happens. You're having an argument with someone will play devil's advocate and say, that's not good, and then leave you hanging. But no, Rava says, okay, but I have a different answer. So Rava says, my hagalanami, shtifa umirika. I'll leave this to you more for when we get to kachim, but I will tell you that what they're saying here is hagala doesn't really mean hagala. Hagala means, okay, of course you have to kosher it with burning, with a fire, but in addition, you need shtifal mirika, which is this pasuk that says that you have to wash the utensils that you use, and that is what it's talking about here. So, Amarle Abaye says that's not really a good answer, Rava, because midame mirika shtifa b'tzonen hagala b'chamin. It says hagala bechamin, which means boil it in hot water. Shtifa mirika is done with cold water. So you can't possibly say that when it says in the Mishnah, magilam bechamin, it means mirikan shtifa. So that doesn't work. So just like I said with Rava, he said, Rav Shesha, your answer is not good, and brought a different answer. Here we're going to have Abai says, Rava, your answer is not good, but I'll bring a different one. Ela Amar Abai, Yagid alav re'o. Okay, Yagid alav re'o is a quote from Eov. Okay, interesting. We're quoting Eov at the end of Masechet Avodah Zarah. Eov was known not to be Jewish. Anyway, that's just a side point. But he's not the only non-Jew we're going to quote in today's stuff. Yagid alav re'o means the friend will tell for you. Okay, what does that really mean? Well, it means that each Mishnah is kind of a friend to the other, meaning each Mishnah is telling about the other. So one Mishnah said Magilam be'chami, and one Mishnah said Milabnan be'ol. Really? You do both, in both. Okay, so that's what we're going to read right now. Tanahacha libun v'uadin lahagala. Tanahata magala v'uadin libun. Each one focused on one element, but they really actually mean both. This, by the way, is similar. It's different, but we just had the Mayim and the Eifer, and one said the Mayim, one said the Eifer, and we actually said you do both, but it's kind of different. But anyway, Amarle Rava now retorts back to Abaye after Abaye contradicted Rava. Okay, we know they're always raising issues with each other. So Rava says, Kachim hainutam. Rava says, Ihachi ninu lekulu b'chada. If you really want to say Yagid alav re'o, the general way that works is in one place it'll say everything, and in one place it will say part of it, and you'll understand from the other one that has both to the one that only has one. So therefore he says, Litnei chad be'idach. Ihachi litnei lekulu b'chada. All of them should have been said in one of the places, one of the Mishnahs. V'litnei chad be'idach, and then you should have one of them listed in the other place. Be'idach hachrite in the other one. V'lema yagid alav re'o, and then you should say it. So it doesn't really work. Now, if you remember, Rava was answer number 2. Now, Rava comes back, since his answer was already contradicted, he now comes back with a retort and says, I have answer number. We're now up to answer number 4. El Amar Rava, Kachim hainu tamayu k'derav Nachman Amar Rab refuah. You know what? There's someone else who says something about this. Da'amar, and we're going to say it goes according to what Rav Nachman said in the name of Rav refuah. Da'amar kol yom v'yom na'aseh gi'ul lechavero. Now, think about the temple. The temple was always going, and the spits were always being used. So every day they would kosher, and when they would use it the next day, it would kind of get the flavor out for the previous day and resolve the issue. This doesn't really resolve the issue, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the thing. I mentioned the chatat immediately becomes notar the next morning. Shlamim has 2 days. Okay, basically the day you give her the sacrifice and the next day. So tinach shlamim. This works for a shlamim because since you have 2 days in which to eat it, notar, before it becomes notar, kavi gil. So day 1, Sunday, you make the korban. Monday, it's still good. And you use it ready for something else. So all the flavor of the shlamim from that day comes out, and then you can keep going. So if it's a spit for shlamim, you're fine. But we don't use all the spits, only for shlamim. But since the chatat is going to go for the day and the night, it's only eaten that day and that night. And already the next day it's going to be a problem. When you cook it the next day and you're saying that's going to kosher it, because as I'm turning the spit on and the fire on, it's going to get out the flavor, it's already notar. So that's not going to work. So and when you cook it the next day, when you are koshering at the same time, and then you cook it with a shlamim or a chata, kapalit notar, the chata ta'idna b'chata u'shlamim delamachar. You're going to have a problem because you're basically spitting out chata, which is already notar, and that's going to ruin it. So that doesn't work. Amre lo tzricha, he says, no, well, this is the way it's going to work, and this is quite complicated. What you have to do is, it's not so complicated to understand, but it's a complicated thing to think about. This is how they did in the temple. You would burn the chatat in the morning, let's say. Then you would burn the shlamim that same day. When you burn the shlemim on the spit, what would happen? The chatat flavor would come out. There'd be no chatat left. Tomorrow, right? So the chatat de lamachar ushlamim de etmo bahadi adadi kashalim zimnayu, right? So the chatat the next day would then be good because you'd be fine because the chatat the next day and the shlemim you make the next day now is only absorbing shlemim from the day before, and that's still good on that day. And then you broil, then you burn on it the shlamim of the next day. So every day you're basically doing chatat shlamim. And in that way, if you end with shlamim, you're actually okay because you've koshered it. So that works. But what's the problem? Well, remember, this was all to explain, okay? What did he say? The reason why you need to do this, right? The reason why you're okay is because it's always getting. That's why you don't need libun. So that resolved why it says in our Mishnah, or, and you don't need to do that for the zvachim. But what's the problem? That's not what it says by zvachim. What does it say by zvachim? It doesn't say you don't have to do anything because you have the solution. It says, well, why does it say you have to magilan b'chamim? There's no point magilan b'chamim. If every day you burn off the taste, there's no point to boil it. So that didn't work. So after that whole long explanation, that was answer number 4, we rejected. Kasha. Rav Papa Amar, Hai Khalid, Hai Lo Khalid. This is an interesting answer. He says remember in the Beit HaMikdash they're going all the time, so it never gets dried out and caked on. So it's constantly being reused. So perhaps you don't need a serious type of koshering. It's enough to just kosher it with water, with hot water, because it's constantly being moved around. But the shpuva askala that was used for non-kosher at some point is going to be, right, that was used a while ago, who knows when, and it could be caked on, it's just much harder, and it doesn't come out as easily, and then you need the fire. So that's a possible answer. This one actually isn't rejected. Rav Ashi Amar, but Rav Ashi goes back and resuscitates the first answer. And he says, the olam kedamrina mi'ikar. It's really the first one. It's because when the meat got absorbed, the chata, it was actually heter that got absorbed, and the meat in our Mishnah was Isser. And because it was Isser, it's harder to get Isser out or something. We don't know exactly. And de kakashalach, now we already raised a question on this. What did we say? Kakashalach, de be'ina de kapalit isura. De kapalit isura, what's the difference when it spits out? It's spitting out Isser. Who cares how it got absorbed? Be'idana de kapalit lo ite li isura be'ene. So this is a very interesting thing, that in the end, when it spits it out, the Isser is not there in actuality. It's not in existence right now. So because it's not in existence and you don't see the Isser, so, right, it's just taste. So it's actually not as strong. And therefore, we end up with these 2 possible explanations as to how we can resolve this contradiction. Now, ad kama milabnan. So now how long do you have to, right? You ever go to Hagala, when you do Libun, Erev Pesach, I don't know if you go to those places before Pesach, right? So how long do you have to do this for? Ad shetashir klipatan, until like a layer comes off of it. There's a lot of halacha l'maaseh about this stuff, and there's tons of different opinions, especially when we get to the knife case. Unfortunately, it's also a Siyum and also it's a daf yomi shir, but I recommend if you, even just in the Gemara, there's footnotes and halacha sections, and I recommend you read about it. It's just really interesting to see all different kinds of opinions that exist and that are based on our Gemara. Anyway, we're going to continue on. Ketzad Magila. Now, how do you kosher things? Okay, this is basic, right? Koshering. This is like, koshering 101. Amarav Huna, yorek tana b'toch yorek dola. If you have a small pot, you put it in a bigger pot. Boil it in the big pot. Yorek dola mai, what do you do with the big pot? So, tashma dahi dura. Duda, dahave be'ravakavya. So they say, we're going to learn from here. There was a big pot in that Ravakavya had. A hadrole gedanfa. They put around it, okay, gedanfa delisha apuma. This sounds a little bit strange. Rashi explains what they do. They put like a dough around the side, like some sort of dough. In order, Rashi says, Kadesha tekabel mayim harbe v'yavru rotchina sfata. They wanted to kind of thicken the rim of the pot so that when the water would boil over, it would actually sit for a moment at the top of the pot and kosher the top of the rim of the pot. And then they would fill it with water and they would boil it. Okay, we're now at the top of Amud Bet. And this, right, we don't really do this nowadays. What do we usually say? We put a rock in a stone. What does that do? It does this, it has the same effect. Okay, instead of, right, you ever think about, I don't know if you go to Airbnbs and you try to kosher things, right? So we don't start putting dough around the top of the rim of the pot and doing this whole thing. But what do? We basically put a stone in, and that allows the water to boil up over the top and go over. And Rava's reaction to hearing that Mar Akavia did this said, "Mancha amarava manchakim lemeabat ki hamilta ilav Rav Akavia degaver Rabahu." What a brilliant guy, Rav Akavia! Right? We're so impressed that he came up with this. Who else would be as smart as him to come up with the solution? Because it's not how to come up with the solution; it's how can we kosher the top of the pot? He's going to say like this, because it's not really that there's water boiling on the top of the pot. So he explained, "Kasavar kibol o kach bolto." This is the whole theory of kashrus. The same way it absorbs, that's how it spits out. And ma bol o benitzotzot af bolto benitzotzot. Now, how did the top of the rim of this pot become problematic in the first place? It became problematic because basically water spritzed on it, right? Or whatever isser was in the pot spritzes on the top and spritzes in that way. So that's the same way to kosher it. All you have to do is get the water to go up and over, the same way that it was absorbed. Okay, next. We're almost at the end. So I told you there's a surprise story. We're getting there soon. First, we have some details about knives. Hasakin shafa v'hitohora. So what do you do with a knife? You polish it, and that resolves it. Okay, polishing, assuming it seems like you're smoothing it down, but it's not so simple. Now, there's a big girsa issue here. Is there a vav? Is there not a vav? Is this in addition to the Mishnah? That also you have to stick it in the ground 10 times? You've heard about this, sticking in the ground 10 times, which many of you have heard about this. This is where it comes from. You stick the knife in the ground 10 times. We're going to see in a minute. It has to be new land that wasn't planted in yet. It's hard. It can really get it out. Some people say, halacha l'maaseh, I will have a little bit. You have to keep putting it in different spots, possibly, because every time you put it in one spot already, it's then used, and then you have to keep going. But there's a big machloket here, and this is what's more interesting. Is this an alternative to polishing, or is it in addition to polishing? And that all depends whether you have a vav there or not a vav. And the ones who say that it's an alternative makes a little more sense, because if you needed to do both, then why didn't the Mishnah mention it? There are cases where that happens. Anyway, it's a big machloket. Amar Rav Kahana u'bisakin yafeh she'ein bagumot. Another modification here. It has to have no nicks in it. If there's nicks in it, obviously things could get stuck in there. Tanya namihachi sakin yafeh she'ein bagumot. Here's a bright that proves it. Noatza sarap hami bekarko. Okay, if you have a nice knife that doesn't have any nicks in it or indentation, then you stick it in the ground 10 times. Amar Rav Huna b'reid Rav Yeshua lechol bat sonein. He says, wait, this is only for eating cold, though. This doesn't kosher it if it was used for heat, and if you want to use it for something hot. Okay. Now the Rama basically says, it's hard not to add the halacha l'maaseh in. He says, don't keep this knife in your house if you can only use it for cold, because it's going to get totally confused and no one's going to remember that it could be only used for cold. So he's kind of saying maybe this is like on a one-off. Okay, this doesn't mean you can really use this to kosher knives that we use for heat or you want to use for hot. And, like you shouldn't have a knife around that can only be eaten with cold food. Not a good recommendation. Now, here we're going to end with this story, okay? And this is all trying to prove this idea about sticking it in the ground 10 times. Ready for the story? This is the highlight. Ki hadamar Yehuda ubati bartuvi. Bati Bartuvi, by the way, is mentioned in one other sugya that I think it was that he was too proud or something to take his get shechur, and he was an Eved Knani, which is like a pseudo-Jew. He was supposed to be free, but then he wouldn't accept his freedom emancipation document, which kind of puts him in a place that he's still an Eved Knani. But remember, Eved Knani is sort of also Jewish. So anyway, here goes our story. Bar Yehuda and Bati Bartuvi were sitting. They're sitting in front of Shavor Malka. He's someone who comes up. In fact, he's come up before at the end of a Masechet, I recall. He is a Persian king, and it's like a name like Paro. They're all called Shavor Malka, the Persian kings. And he often had good relationships with the Jews, not always, but usually. And here you're going to see an interesting story. So he was sitting with Mar Yehuda and Bati Bartuvi. Lekamayu etrog. They bring an etrog in front of them. Now, an etrog, I'm not going to get into all this halachot, but it's like a lemon. It's considered sharp, which means the flavor comes out, which means more problem. Pasak achil, pasak v'havle. So he sat down to eat. Pasak v'havle lebati bartuvi. So now he goes and he gives to Bati Bartuvi, and he says, pasik, he cuts a piece and eats, and then he goes and gives a piece to Bati Bartuvi, cuts it and eats. Hadar datza asara zimne ba'ara. In the middle of this scene, okay, we have Shavor Malka. First of all, It's a little bit strange. I'm going to add some interpretations to the story from a fascinating short article that I found by Tomav Duvdvani on the Beit Avichai's website. Very interesting little article, and I'm going to add her commentary to this as we read. So she points out first that Shavar Malki you would expect not to be serving. He's a king, right? Kings don't serve people food. They don't start cutting up. So it already starts off a little bit strange. You have the king serving food. And it looks like he's kind of switched positions and is in the servant mode rather than the king mode. However, what is a king? A king is someone who has authority. They know what's going on. And it's clear that he's calling the shots and he's managing what's going on. So he cuts, cuts, gives himself a piece. Okay, he does take first. He cuts another piece. He gives to Bati Bartuvi. Now, the way she describes this very well in the story is you assume right now that Bati Bartuvi is more close to the king than Rabbi Yehuda is, and that Mar Yehuda is, and that's why he's giving Bati Bartuvi first. Then Hadardatza Asara Zimni Bakarka. Now he takes that knife and he koshers the knife. Okay, he sticks it in the ground 10 times. Pasakavle Lemar Yehuda. He cuts a piece, gives it to Mar Yehuda. Amale Bati Bartuvi. Now, Bati Bartuvi is sitting there. Now, I think, if you take her reading is Bati Bartuvi sees what's going on. He said, the king must like me better. And then all of a sudden realizes, wait, why did he just kosher this for him and not for me? I keep kosher, right? Remember, Abadim Ktanim have to keep those laws. So he says, Amale Bati Bartuvi, Ba'u Gavra Lav Bar Yisrael who? What? Are you saying I'm not a Jew? You don't treat me like a Jew? You're treating the Jew like that. What? You're not treating me like that? Amarle, mar kimle begave, mar lo kimle begave. He says to him that here comes the king all-knowing. He keeps the law and you don't really keep the law. Ika de Amre. Now, some people say that wasn't a harsh enough version of a better version. Amarle, it karmai avit ba'orta. I remember what you did last night. Okay, what happened last night? We don't know. Okay, those are the last words of the Masechet. Rashi tells us the derech Persim limsor nashim la'achsaneim. The Persians would give the night before their guests would come to their house, they would give them a woman. So kishashiglan lehem balayla shaval, when he sent women to Bar Yehuda and to Bati Bartuvi, kibel Bati, Rabbi Yehuda lo kibel. Bati accepted the woman, Rabbi Yehuda didn't accept the woman. So Tamar Duvdvani has this great thing where she says, first of all, she points out how the knife cuts the story in half, and it cuts. She has this nice image of the knife cutting it. There's this clear separation between Bati Bartuvi and what happens first and what happens. And it's also called a twist in the plot, right? Because you think that he's separating and treating the Jew differently. The Jew's going to get last, but in the end, it's the Jew, the Mar Yehuda, who he has the ultimate respect for. And his separating is actually showing his respect for him. And what she says in a very nice way, she says that I'm going to kind of put in my words what she says, but that there's this idea of that you would think that creating barriers would create antagonism, right? That if we separate ourselves, and this whole Masechet's been talking about separating ourselves in all sorts of ways from right? She quotes the Khatam Sofer, who basically says that connects between the arayot issue and that the whole idea of bishul akum and even kashrut is separating ourselves so that we don't end up intermarrying, and that connects back to these ideas. And that what she's saying here is that sometimes barriers can help generate respect. By ourselves separating ourselves, it causes the others to look at us and see us for what our values are and respect us for it. So what I was thinking about the end of this Masechet, I will just say Hadran al HaSocher Socher Tapol Uslika al Masechet Avodah Zarah, and with this we're going to end our Masechet. I want to just think about some ideas that I was thinking about how the Masechet progresses. And we start off in the Masechet with the keep away from them on their holidays and all the separation and all the things that they're steeped in that we don't believe in and all of that. And the whole end of the Masechet, which if you think it ends with koshering, which seems a little strange, but what's koshering and the things that led up to it are all these ways that we're actually in interaction. We're working together with them. How do we do the Gein Nesech? How do we deal with this? We're working together with them. We're in the got with them. We're doing all sorts of things with them. We're even at the end of this eating in their table at the king's table, right? And we do interact with them. And there's no perfect answers and there's no black and white. And well, you might say, okay, there's Jews and there's Avodah Zarah and non-Jews, and there is no black and white. And I've talked about this a lot at the end of Masechtot, and I think that often at the end of the Masechet, they like to remind you how complex these situations are. And even just this idea that the Tamar Dubdavan is talking about, I think is something that we're always trying to strike that balance. How much do we separate? How much do we together? And it's a constant thing that we're always grappling with. And there's no clear-cut answers. And sometimes it could be very positive, and sometimes it could lead to negative. And we're always trying to walk that tightrope of finding that proper balance. And I think this story highlights those struggles that we have. It's interesting. Our next talk is also going to talk about balance and how to balance different values. So it'll all tie in. And with that, we are finishing our Masechet. So we will say the Hadrons. I'm going to pull them up. Okay. Everybody ready? Hadran alach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'Hadrach Halan. Da'atan alach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'Da'atach Halan. Lo nitnashem minach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'lo titnashem minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'Hadrach Halan. Da'atan alach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'Da'atach Halan. Lo nitnashem minach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'lo titnashem minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'Hadrach Halan. Da'atan alach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'Da'atach Halan. Lo nitnashem minach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'lo titnashem minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. We're going to stop for a quick minute, and we're going to hear from Terri do her Siyum Hadran.
Hadran alach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'Talmud Bavli v'Hadrach Halan. Da'atan alach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'Talmud Bavli v'Da'atach Halan. Lo nitnashem minach Masechet Avodah Zarah v'Talmud Bavli v'lo tinashem minan lo ba'alma hadin v'lo ba'alma da'ate.
Yihi ratzon l'fanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu shetehei toratcha u'manutenu ba'olam hazeh u'tehei imanu la'olam haba. Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rachman bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surcha bar Papa, Adar bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratcha בפינו ובפיות עמך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו כולנו צאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. מאוהבי תחכמני מצוותיך, כי לעולם היא לי. יהי ליבי תמים בחוקיך, למען לא אבוש. לעולם לא אשכח פיקודיך, כי בם חייתני. ברוך אתה אדוני למדני חוקיך, אמן, 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 סלע ועד. יהי רצון לפניך אדוני אלוהי, כשם שעזרתני לסיים מסכת עבודה זרה, כן תעזרני להתחיל מסכתות וספרים אחרים ולסיימם, ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות, ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. וזכות כל התנאים והאמוראים ותלמידי חכמים יעמוד לנו ולזרענו, שלא תמוש התורה מפינו ומפי זרענו עד עולם. ויתקיים בנו בתהלכך תנחה אותך, בשוכבך תשמור עליך, בהקיצות היא תשיחך. כי בי ירבו ימיך ויוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים בימינה, בשמאלה עושר וכבוד, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. Shkach to everybody. Mazal tov. We're going to quickly start Masechet Horayot, okay, which is our very short 13-page Masechet. Great opportunity to get some people to join. And coming up, okay, I'll just mention, I mentioned it in class a few times, but we have a Siyum in 2 weeks already. Okay, so on Sunday night, there'll be a Siyum in English on Zoom, and the usual time at around 8:30. And on Monday night, we have a live event in Jerusalem. Everyone who is around and can come is invited. It'll be a very special event, so we're hoping to see people there too. That will be in Hebrew. Okay, and with that, we're going to start Masechet Horayot. Horu Beitim, we'll talk more about intro to it and all that tomorrow. And if you didn't listen yet to Ayelet's introduction and Shirin Chamutal's and Daf Mishalahen, there's lots of stuff out there right now to be looking at our site. Horu Beit Din la'avor al achat mikol mitzvot ha'amurot b'Torah. The Beit Din teaches. Now this really goes back to Sanhedrin and the Beit Din. Okay, we kind of got tangented off, and Avodah Zarah, they say, got there because also it had to do with Avodah Zarah was mentioned in Sanhedrin. So now we get back to Horu Beit Din la'avor al achat mikol mitzvot ha'amurot b'Torah. Now the rabbis tell you do something that's wrong. Okay, they make a mistake. If an individual then goes and does something mistakenly based on what they said, okay, whether he does it with them, with the judges who said the mistaken ruling, or they did it and then he followed, or they didn't do it at all, and he or she decided, I'm going to do what the court said. Patul, it's not that person's responsibility. Okay, this reminds us all the way back in Adamu ad Olam and Baba Kama, you're responsible for everything. Well, actually, you're not responsible when the Beit Din tells you you're supposed to do this, you're actually exempt. This actually leads really to the Parhalim Davar Shel Tzibor, but we're going to get on to all of that. We have lots of time. We're going to deal with that for the next 13 dapim. Okay, with that, we're going to move on to the next part of our program. We're going to hear from Khaya Eisenberg, who very openly reached out and said, this is what I'm writing a doctorate on this topic, and it comes up from our Masechet, and I really love to talk about this. So Khaya is basically a clinical psychologist doing a PhD specifically on issues about navigating conflicts between halacha and professional ethics. And we're going to hear from Khaya from a sugya that comes up from the beginning of the Masechet about this topic.
Thank you so much. Mazel tov, everyone. Thank you so much to Rabbanit Michelle and to Hadran for the opportunity to speak here. I began learning the daf in January 2020, and it's been a really wonderful addition to my life. And I'm very grateful to Rabbanit Michelle and to Hadran for making it so accessible to us. So, as Rabbanit Michelle mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm writing a dissertation now on navigating professional ethics as an Orthodox Jewish psychologist. And our Masechet makes an important appearance in my dissertation, and I'm excited to talk about it and to share it with you. So I'm just going to share a PowerPoint that I prepared. Okay. Let me just see if I can move the slide. Okay. So, psychologists, like all professionals, are obligated to adhere to a code of ethics. Ethical codes for professionals developed because there's a power differential between a professional and a client. A professional has a certain expertise that the client doesn't have, and this can allow the professional to mislead or exploit the client without the client being aware of it. The obligation to adhere to professional ethics codes is meant to offset that danger. In Western culture, one of the fundamental principles of professional psychology ethics is the obligation to respect a client's autonomy and self-determination. So yes, the psychologist is the professional, and the psychologist is guiding the client in improving their mental health. And at the same time, the psychologist remains mindful of professional ethics, and unless there's a serious risk of harm, psychologists are obligated to encourage their clients to make their own decisions. Psychologists are not meant to push clients in a particular direction, and this is the case even when the psychologist strongly disagrees with a choice that a client is making. Halacha, on the other hand, mandates obedience first to God and to his Torah. Adherence to halacha is prioritized over respecting a client's autonomy. Now, it's true that a professional has a halachic obligation to serve his client ethically based on the inherent promise in agreeing to work for the client. But when a professional and a client are both Jewish, they are viewed as equal members of the same community when it comes to obeying halacha. Halacha does not acknowledge a special obligation for a professional to respect a client's autonomy as part of the professional relationship. Now, in practice, professional psychology norms and halachic obligations don't often conflict. And when these norms conflict, the conflict is usually not intractable. So, for example, pikuach nefesh and safek pikuach nefesh are prioritized by halacha. And in the field of mental health, these concepts are actually very broadly defined. That means that there's quite a bit of wiggle room when a client needs to violate certain halachic obligations in order to protect his mental health. You think about kibbud av va'em, right? Classically, psychotherapy encourages a client to reflect critically on his upbringing and possibly critique his parents. And this would seem like a conflict. And yet these conflicts are more resolved, usually more easily than one would think. but sometimes these conflicts are more complex. So our Masechet on Daf Vav talks about the prohibition against doing business with an idol worshiper 3 days before his religious holiday. The rabbis discuss the reason for this prohibition, and they suggest that if the transaction supplies the idol worshiper with an object that he can then use for idol worship, such as an animal, then the person who is supplying this object may be guilty of Lifnei Iver. The Gemara then explains the prohibitions of Lifnei Iver lo titein michshol and misayeh lidvar avera. These prohibitions refer to the forbidden behavior of helping another person commit a sin. Lifnei Iver, a more serious Doraita prohibition, is introduced with an example. A description of a Nazir who is separated from a forbidden glass of wine by a river. An individual who provides the wine for the Nazir to drink is guilty of a serious offense because the Nazir is incapable of obtaining the wine without the person's help. We extrapolate from this example of Trei Avra de Nahara, 2 banks of the river, that it is a serious transgression to help a person commit a sin when that person cannot commit the sin without your assistance. A less strict Rabbanan prohibition, misayeh lidvar avera, refers to the situation of providing assistance to a sinner who is capable of committing the sin without your help. In the language of the Gemara, this is a situation of chad avra. The Nazir is on the same side of the river as the wine and can get it himself if he chooses. In a situation of misayeh lidvar avera, although helping the person commit the sin is still a transgression of halacha, it's a lesser transgression and it may be dealt with more flexibly when there are extenuating circumstances. Let's consider how the prohibition of Lifnei Iver and misayeh lidvar avera might conflict with the professional obligation for a psychologist to respect a client's self-determination in a psychotherapy setting. For example, can a halacha observant psychologist provide marital counseling to a couple if he has discovered that they are participating in a halachically illicit union? If an Orthodox Jewish client is experiencing scrupulosity, a form of religious OCD, can his therapist help him complete exposures that teach him to tolerate being less meticulous in his religious observance? When a psychologist learns that his client is violating religious commandments and responds to this with professional neutrality that the client interprets as validation and approval, is the psychologist guilty of contributing to the client's sinful behavior? Although halacha does hold people personally responsible for their own actions, halacha also recognizes a relational piece and the fact that somebody can have a share or some responsibility in somebody else's wrongdoing. So if in providing psychotherapy to a client who's engaged in sinful behavior, I am in some way halachically complicit in his actions, then it matters whether my complicity is lifnei iver doraisa or misayeh lidvar avera derabanan. If the therapy I'm providing is misayeh lidvar avera, there might be more allowances for what I'm permitted to do in order to preserve my license and my livelihood, and some room to err on the side of leniency if it's uncertain whether I'm actually transgressing this mitzvah. But if in providing psychotherapy to a client, I'm guilty of Lifnei Iver, then that's more serious. And I need to be more sensitive to and cautious about the way clients use my guidance. So this is, of course, not a psak halacha. I'm not qualified to give one. And halacha does tend to be very contextual and case-based. But I'm going to share my reflections on 2 possible justifications for considering a therapist's complicity in a therapy client's sinful behavior to be misayeh lidvar avera derabanan rather than lifnei iver doraisa. So first of all, the client can choose from any number of therapists. He doesn't necessarily need to see this one. Clients also have multiple sources of information, especially in today's day and age. So in my view, a client is not wholly dependent on a therapist's guidance. And second, I think about the case of a therapist I know who was helping his client overcome a phobia of driving. The therapist recommended that his client engage in a graduated series of exposures to driving, beginning with sitting in his parked car in the driveway and turning on the engine. The client was Jewish, not religious, and immediately said, "Great, I'll start this Saturday." Was this therapist guilty of Lifnei Iver? Well, Even in cases where therapists do give direct instruction in therapy, the client has a great deal of autonomy regarding whether and how to follow these instructions. A client who's choosing to violate halacha when following his therapist's instructions is usually doing so of his own volition, although admittedly there are more complicated cases. Sex therapy is a little bit more complicated because there is more dependence on the therapist's instruction. So, one of the things that I find so fascinating about this topic is that the question of client autonomy illustrates a significant values difference between professional ethics and halacha. Western professional ethics classically prioritizes autonomy and leaves little room to challenge a client when you believe his behavior is wrong. Halacha is more nuanced about this issue. But recently, some secular ethicists have been advocating for psychologists to be more open to challenging their clients' ethical behavior. They argue that psychologists should be striving for more balance between, on the one hand, yes, respecting autonomy, but also raising the client's awareness of his obligations to others. This position suggests that, in their view, maybe psychologists do share a little bit of ethical responsibility for the actions of their clients. And this ethical view has already been much discussed and reflected upon in halacha. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your professional expertise and personal experience. We really appreciate it. It's one of the things we love at Hadran, and everybody takes the daf and connects it with their lives and takes it to a new place and enriches everybody else in the process. And with that, we're going to introduce Terri, who is started as the leader of the Hadran Women of Minneapolis, has recently made Aliyah, which we're also excited about, those of us living here, and we get to see you on the daily Zoom, which is great. And Terri is a real leader, and we're very excited to hear her Daf Yomi journey. And no.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, Khaya, thank you for your interesting perspective. That was really amazing. And it just never know where these things come up and where you can hear about them. So I really want to, I appreciate that. And Rabbanit Michelle, I want to thank you so much for asking me to speak today. And I want to dedicate my talk today to my parents, Nachum Meir ben David Be'er Malka and Cheni Mendel Bat Yerachmiel Kohen and Shima Fega, from where this all began. I was born and grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, one of those flyover states that the New Yorker made fun of in its iconic View of the World cartoon. Even so, I was 5 years old before I realized that not everyone was Jewish. My parents raised my sister and me to put Judaism at the center of our lives from the day we were born. I remember when a kindergarten classmate invited me to have lunch at her home. I really do remember this. In the middle of lunch, a light bulb went off in my head that prompted me to ask my friend's mother, "Are we having milchik or fleishik for lunch?" Yes, I grew up in a kosher home in a city without a kosher butcher. My friend's mother heard these foreign words, called my mother and said, "Your daughter's speaking in tongues. Come pick her up and take her home." So that night was the first time my parents had a talk with me, and they explained that the whole world wasn't Jewish, that not everyone kept kosher, and how to handle the next time I was at a play date where I was offered lunch. Putting Judaism at the center of our lives also meant love of Israel was a core value. As I progressed through high school, junior high and high school, I became interested in learning more about Judaism and its ancient texts. For college, I chose what was then the joint program between the Jewish Theological Seminary and Columbia, the School of General Studies at Columbia. And I was lucky enough to meet my husband in the first semester of college. I had never really met anyone like him who had a love of Judaism like my own. Chaim had no idea where Nebraska was, but he learned soon enough. We spent our junior year studying at Hebrew University in Israel, where we took most of our classes in Hebrew. And that year was the jumpstart to our shared fluency in Hebrew and helped us create shared memories of living here. The first time I learned Talmud was second semester of freshman year in college. My teacher was Dr. Judith Hauptman. I had no idea that Dr. Hauptman was traversing a new road for women to study Talmud. I thought she seemed smart and was a great pedagogue, and the topic was interesting. So I decided to major in Talmud, and at the time I was one of the few women Talmud majors at Liss College. I then attended the Cardozo School of Law, graduated, and began what turned out to be a 41-year career as a corporate and mergers and acquisitions lawyer. At my first firm, Paul Weiss in New York, we had a group who studied Mishnah once a week, led by another then associate, David Zweibel, who left Paul Weiss to become general counsel to Agudath Israel and then its CEO. During law school, I remember the first time I was in a civil procedure class when the professor began to discuss the importance of interpreting facts within the specific context, and I was struck by how familiar my Talmud training was and what good prep it was for my legal studies. My knowledge of Hebrew and Talmudic law helped me a few times in my career. And one of the funniest stories was when I had a client who bought a cookie company. So the sellers had kosher certification from the OU, and the buyers, my clients, were Jewish, though not observant. And the transaction closed in the first quarter of whatever year it was, but not long before Passover. So when the OU rabbi came to inspect right after the sale had been done, he explained to the clients, now that he realized they were Jewish, they'd have to close the company, the manufacturing facility, and also the corporate office. And he left, and my clients called me and he said, "We have to do what?" They were just stunned. So I said, "Have the OU rabbi call me, who's in charge of your company, and we'll see what we can do." So he called me and talked for quite a while about what he believed was the predicament. This was a phone call. When he finally stopped talking, I asked him if he was concerned about Chametz Shavar Lava Pesach. Well, it's too bad it wasn't a Zoom call, because the phone went dead for at least a minute. And a woman attorney from a Minneapolis, and I can imagine him thinking, "Oh, there's this woman attorney from a Minneapolis law firm challenging his opinion with a halachic citation." Finally, he recovered his composure and said, "Oh, so you know what I'm talking about?" I said I did. And we then discussed if they could close the factory and not the corporate office. And the rabbi stammered a bit and said he talked to the big boss about whether the corporate office could stay open. To this day, I don't know whether the big boss was God or it was his actual boss. But I never stopped loving the Talmud. Life got in the way. Roll forward to 2018, the middle of Avodah Zarah in the 13th cycle. I borrowed the book If All the Seas Were Ink, written by Alana Kirshan, from my son Avi and daughter-in-law Shayna while visiting them one winter weekend in East Lakeview, Chicago. I read the entire book before we left Chicago and decided then that I would figure out how to integrate Daf Yomi into my life ASAP. At the Midway airport, as we were waiting to return to Minneapolis, I began to tool around on the internet trying to find a podcast to listen to in order to begin Daf Yomi. Well, I found a lot of podcasts taught by men from yeshivas with pronunciations I couldn't understand. And then I stumbled upon Hadran. I couldn't believe it. The daily daf taught by a woman with pronunciations I could understand. Finding the Hadran podcast was not an accident. That was my own hashgachat prati. And so my Daf Yomi journey began. And when my husband and I came to Israel the summer of 2018, I asked enough times that Rabbanit Michelle agreed that I could come to her house for one of the sessions that were just being recorded at the time. And I just had to have a mental image when I went back to Minneapolis of what this was going to look like. And then as the days grew closer to the Siyum for the 13th cycle in 2020, I decided I needed to attend. I thought the first woman Siyum was going to be history making, and I wanted to be witness. And I have been, because of my career, to many events celebrating the leadership of women, but I've never been to an event that celebrated the intellectual prowess of women. And it was amazing. I'm getting goosebumps even talking about it. 3,000 women attended and a few men. And at the end of the Siyum, those finishing HaShas were asked to stand up to say the Hadrans. I fully expected at least half of those people in attendance would stand up. There were two hands full. I was so astonished and proud of the number of women and a few men who came to fet the women who had completed HaShas. That was probably one of the most inspiring evenings of my whole life. Little did any of us know at the time that the world as we knew it was about to shut down. And one of the constants in my life, and I think for many of you, have been Daf Yomi, and it continued to be an anchor in my life. One of my former law partners, when I told him what I was doing, said he couldn't imagine doing anything every day other than brushing his teeth. Since I began learning Daf Yomi, we've been through the pandemic. All four of my husband and my parents passed away. Two of our three grandchildren were born. October 7th happened and the war began. Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. The Iranian war happened and we made Aliyah. I began to think during those days of the pandemic what daf yomi meant to me and made what I thought was a neder, which I have realized after further study was actually a shavua, that if a sick member of my family recovered, I would do a page of Gemara every day for the rest of my life. Someone asked me last week if I was going to stop, so no, I'm not going to stop. I began to participate in real time when I was in Israel during the 14th cycle with the morning 7:15 class with Rabbanit Michelle. And our Zoom group has become a true community, celebrating our simchas and holding each other up in difficult times. The strength and resilience of this group, many of whom have never met each other face to face, is truly remarkable. When we made Aliyah in July 2024, I was happy to participate every weekday live with Rabbanit Michelle's Zoom session, and then I began to study Talmud more in depth at Pardes with Rav Daniel Reifman and at Nitzanim with Rav Shai Finkelstein. These classes have augmented my daf yomi learning, and they're helping me to increase my skills and go deeper into the Talmud. From my father, I learned that anytime a client came to my office, my job was to determine the questions they didn't ask. Because he said, once the questions are clear, the answers are apparent. One of the things I love the most about my Talmud study is the debate among the rabbis over the questions. I began to yearn to understand on each page of Talmud I studied the relationship of the rabbis who were talking. I was a history major at Columbia, and I just wanted to understand more of what was going on. So I tried to find a study guide, and when I couldn't, I began creating my own, a set of 4x6 cards, color-coded so a learner can identify when the rabbi lived and have a better sense of how the conversations presented on the page happened. My husband, who proudly watched me and supported me learn the daf until now, decided, like me, to begin doing daf yomi in the middle of Avodah Zarah this year. We look forward to finishing Shas together the next time. When my dad, a lifelong learner himself, celebrated his second bar mitzvah, my sister wrote a list of the top 10 things we learned from him. I want to close with that list, and the love of Judaism and the strong ideals of both my parents have continued to provide encouragement for me in everything I do. 1, find your passion and then do what you love. 2, strength comes from within. 3, self-confidence is a choice. 4, challenges are not obstacles to overcome, but rather opportunities from which to learn. 5, yesterday is done, tomorrow is uncertain, make today count. 6, never stop learning, growing means living. 7, give not just of your time or of your money, but also give of your heart. 8, kindness matters and words are powerful. 9, girls can too, never feel limited. And last but not least, 10, martinis are best with gin and olives. Thank you, and I can't wait to continue to study with all of you starting tomorrow morning.
Wow. Thank you, Terri. That was really, really
My
exceptionally
pleasure.
beautiful.
Thank you for
Very
asking me to speak. It
inspiring.
was really, it was nice to put it together, and it was just, I love you all.
The feelings are mutual. Okay, we are, as Terri said, we've been it's been quite a path these last number of years, and particularly the last few years. So we'll end with our tefillot that we are unfortunately still needing to do. And before we do that, I just want to talk for a very brief moment about our new website. So we launched our new website this week, and thank you to Rabbi Art Gould, who dedicated the website in memory of Carol Joy Robinson, his bride of 50 years, Zichrona Livracha. And we are really honored to be able to provide you all with a newer, smoother way of learning. It's going to take some time for the website to get up. It crashed a few times today. It's getting used to. There's a lot of bugs still. We're working out all the kinks. So a little bit of patience. If you ever have issues in the next few days, you can always listen through a podcast app. You can listen through YouTube. There's ways to find all of our materials in places other than the website. But those of you who don't normally use the website, within a few weeks, I recommend you trying out the website because it has a whole new system where you can track your progress. It'll remember what you're up to. If you want to learn a Masechet, it will be able to track what daf you're up to. So you don't have to each time remember what daf was I up to, where was I, where am I. If you're behind in the daf also, it'll be a much more personalized experience. You can subscribe to your favorite content. You'll get notifications about it. It works somewhat like an app. It's going to be amazing. Thank you to Maggie Sandler, who spent hours and hours and hours and more hours and more hours and more hours. And I can't even count how many hours she spent trying to make this a really fabulous experience for everybody to learn. So special thanks to Maggie, special thanks to Art, and to all the rest of the staff that was involved. And we're very, very excited about it. Okay, and with that, we're going to finish. We're going to have Deborah Lopez, who's going to start us off with the Tefillah L'Chayalim. And her son has been in for over 400 days in the Army. So it's very meaningful, Deborah, that you're going to start us off with that. And then we're going to hear from Alana Storch and Julie Mendelson. Okay, give me 1 minute to just share my screen. And second. Okay. Sorry. Brief moment. Okay, here we go.
Or you can start. Devorah, you can begin. Devorah, we can't hear you. Can you try again to maybe you have the wrong microphone because I see you're unmuted.
Oh, it's not working.
Yes. I think it's your microphone. Just go on your audio little triangle and change the microphone to your system. Sorry, everybody. It'll be just a sec.
No, it's not working. Okay, should we switch? Sorry, Deborah.
Ilana can begin.
So you want me to do for the Chayalim?
Yes, please.
Okay, so it's not, okay, now I see the whole thing, sorry. Um, you have it all there? Okay. Misha Beirach Avotenu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov Hu Yivarech Et Chayalei Tzva Hagana Yisrael v'Anshei Kochot HaBitachon העומדים על משמר ארצנו וערי אלוהינו מגבול הלבנון ועד מדבר מצרים מן הים עד לבוא הערבה ובכל מקום שהם ביבשה באוויר ובים ייתן אדוני את אויבינו הקמים עלינו ניגפים לפניהם הקדוש ברוך הוא ישמור ויציל את חיילינו מכל צרה וצוקה ומכל נגע ומחלה, וישלח ברכה והצלחה בכל מעשה ידיהם. ידבר שונאינו תחתיהם ויעטרם בכתר ישועה ובעטר ניצחון, ויקוים בהם הכתוב, כי אדוני אלוהיכם ההולך עמכם, להילחם לכם עם אויביכם, להושיע אתכם, ונאמר אמן. The next I'm doing as well, right?
Continue, please.
Okay, יהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, שתשלח מהרה רפואה שלמה מן השמיים, רפואת הנפש ורפואת הגוף לכל הפצועים במערכה. הקדוש ברוך הוא ימלא רחמים עליהם, להחלימם, לרפאותם ולהחזיקם, להחיותם, וישלח להם מהרה רפואה שלמה מן השמיים לכל עבריהם, לכל גדיהם, בתוך שאר חולי ישראל, רפואת הנפש ורפואת הגוף, השתה בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ונאמר אמן.
Amen. Julie.
Okay, and with this, I'm praying for a miracle as the mother of a soldier, that both the soldiers and the captives are going to come out of this. Okay.
Amen.
יהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, שתחזק ותשמור ותנצור את אחינו בית ישראל, השבויים והשבויות, בעבור שאנו מתפללים בעבורם. הקדוש ברוך הוא ימלא רחמים עליהם. ישמרם מכל צרה וצוקה ומכל נגע ומחלה, וישלח ברכה והצלחה בכל מעשה ידיהם. יוציאם מחושך וצל מוות, ויושיבם מהרה לחיק משפחותיהם, ונאמר אמן.
Amen. Okay. your tefillah be answered as quickly as possible. Thank you, everyone. Mazal tov. Very good reason to celebrate, and we will celebrate together in another 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks. Looking forward.
Mazal tov, everyone, and yasher koach. How inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Mazal
so much.
tov.
Mazal tov.
Mazal tov, everybody. Khaya, Shana Tova.
Mazal
Tov,
tov.
everybody. Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Mazel tov. Mazel tov.
And we're looking forward to seeing
Khaya.
Zoom.
Is it okay? Oh, okay.
Mazel tov, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, everyone.
Thank you.
We're moving on to our Hebrew Siyum in just 30 minutes. So we're going to cut this off and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.